Saturday night. And I'm just guessing that you might rather come Saturday night rather than Sunday morning, which is photos with Santa. That's our holiday celebration for the little ones. There's a scavenger hunt. They vote on their favorite Christmas tree. And that's the thing about the tree gala. You see us frantically putting all the businesses in Bay St. Louis, nonprofits, they get together, they put trees up. So you get to walk through the winter wonderland if you come to the party. Sunday is for the children, so wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Come Saturday night. It's a more grown-up affair. You'll have a good time. So I have an invitation. I'll make those available, but we do hope you'll stop by and raise a glass with us to enjoy the season. Without further ado, once again, we're so excited today to welcome Tulane English professor, former English.
No, never been professor.
Oh,
No.
but Tulane.
Yeah.
But Tulane. Dr. Erin Grayson Sapp and her husband Scott Sapp.
No, just the opposite. Erin Sapp Grayson and Scott Grayson.
Did I mix it up?
No, I confused the world when I took his last name as my middle name.
You sure did, Missy.
I did, yeah.
You sure did.
His
So it's Grayson.
last name is Gracie.
So it's
I know.
Dr. Sapp.
Yes, and I'm going to be explaining that for the rest of my
Oh,
life.
what? Yes, you will. Yes, you will. Well, we're glad that you're both here. Dr. Erin, I'm going to stay out of trouble with this call Dr. Erin, holds a PhD in English and American History from Tulane University. She has served as scholar in residence for the historic New Orleans collection, writing for their magazine, giving talks on local athletics, and researching the Sugar Bowl and Saints-related topics. Regarding Dr. Erin's book, Moving the Chains, many remember the 1966 birth of the New Orleans Saints as a shady quid pro quo between the NFL commissioner and a Louisiana congressman. Moving the Chains is the untold story of the athlete protest that necessitated this backroom deal. As New Orleans scrambled to respond to a very public repudiation of the racist policies that governed the city. And we're going to hear a lot more about this fascinating topic. I've been getting y'all ready for her visit because I think it's extraordinary. If that had been my dissertation, I would have finished I would have stayed in school. So would you please give a warm authors and characters welcome to Dr. Erin Sapp.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Well, I wrote this book because I, years ago, stumbled upon an old newspaper article about an event that I was shocked I'd never heard of before. And I soon found myself on a quest to uncover how what seemed to me to be a very significant happening had turned into a very little known historical footnote. So I guess today I'll be taking you all down that rabbit hole with me of my early research days when I was struggling to untangle and flesh out this lost story. And that story is the civil rights protest that's mentioned here in the subtitle of the book. And that story being that a pro football league once boycotted the city of New Orleans. So in the early 1960s, sports promoters in New Orleans were trying to get a franchise in either the National Football League or the newer American Football League. And they were hosting, promoters were hosting preseason games, exhibition games, essentially as auditions to prove to the leagues that the city had the fan base necessary to support its own team. And locals were setting attendance records at these games. So both leagues were plenty impressed with the city, and as a result, the Big Easy landed an even bigger event, the 1965 AFL All-Star Game. Now, considering the number of fans who were already paying to see preseason games, which could often just be tryouts for roster cuts, there were reasonable expectations of a sellout crowd, a full Tulane Stadium for a postseason game that showcased the league's best players. It's also important to note that the week of the All-Star Game, the AFL owners meeting was also scheduled, and expansion was known to be a topic on their agenda for discussion. So at the time that the All-Stars were flying into New Orleans, many locals, quite justifiably, thought they might be just a week away from landing their own pro team. When the players touched down, however, the Black All-Stars ran into trouble immediately. The Oakland Raiders' Clint Daniels considered turning around and just flying back home before he even left the airport grounds, after being verbally insulted by a racial slur inside the airport and then being denied taxi service by white cabbies out front. And this was the case for most of the Black All-Stars. The Chiefs' Abner Haynes, for example, waited for hours before a black cabbie ever appeared. Larry Guerin and Houston Antoine's flight came in so late they were stranded completely until a teammate, Billy Shaw, drove over in his station wagon and rescued them from the airport and got them to their hotel. And as for the hotels, for half of the players, their hotel was the famed old Roosevelt near the French Quarter. Now inside the Roosevelt, Hall of Famer Bobby Bell, for one, was refused a table at the hotel restaurant, even though he was an overnight guest upstairs. Two more Hall of Famers, Willie Brown and Buck Buchanan, were told at check-in not to use the main elevator and were directed to a side elevator outside the main lobby.
Wow.
Now, on the other hand, Black All-Stars like Art Powell, not given such information at check-in, were subject to verbal harassment when they did use the main elevator. Well, naturally, many of the players wanted to go out into the city, wanted to go to the French Quarter in particular. Again, at both hotels, the players had trouble getting taxi service. And once they got to the French Quarter, whatever way they could find, they endured verbal insults and were turned away from many nightclubs. Now, both of these offenses were experienced by the Chargers' Ernie Ladd. And this is notable because the Big Cat, as he was called, was 6 feet 9 inches tall and 320 pounds. His teammate, Dick Westmoreland, recalled later walking around the French Quarter with Ladd and just being stunned at all the scrawny white guys who dared insult him to his face. And again, it was also Ladd who was turned away from a final nightclub at gunpoint with the threat that the gun would be used if he didn't leave.
Wow.
Now it was this group who decided on their walk back to the Roosevelt because they couldn't get a taxi to walk out on the game. So they got back to their rooms and essentially started a phone tree, calling other players at both hotels and learning that other players had their own stories of discrimination and abuse from just the very brief time that they've been in New Orleans. So the next day, we're talking within 24 hours of arriving in the city, the Black players had called a meeting and voted to walk out of the game, stating that they couldn't be expected to give 100% on the field and to be treated as less than that outside the stadium. Next, their white teammates followed in solidarity. League executives, at least publicly, supported the players, and the game was moved to Houston. Now this got international attention. It seemed New Orleans had blown any shot at getting its own franchise indefinitely. But the overwhelming reaction from white locals was one of denial and defensiveness. And we're talking from your average guy on the street all the way to Mayor Victor Skiro. It was overwhelmingly a response of denial. And this is not sort of your state's rights, defending our way of doing things kind of denial, but just claims that New Orleans was always a very progressive and tolerant place. So as a result, you don't have any apologetic response and certainly no call for change or action. Well, learning that surprised me because I can do very basic math. This is January 1965, the AFL All-Star Exodus. This is November 1st, 1966, All Saints Day, when NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle is announcing that New Orleans has been awarded a team. So in less than 2 years, the NFL is setting up shop in New Orleans. Well, at this point in my research, I'm wondering, is that how the story got lost? Because it really didn't have any effect or impact. You know, did The NFL even factored the racial situation into its decision to move into New Orleans. So at this point, I need to know more about this expansion decision, and that led me to a far better known story from the era, which many of you are probably familiar with, and that is the widely accepted version of the Saints' origin story. The quid pro quo that Leah mentioned. In 1966, when the two leagues decided to merge, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle needed some pretty hefty antitrust legislation breezed through Congress. And as luck would have it, two very powerful Louisiana congressmen, Hale Boggs and Russell Long, found the loopholes.
We can't understand.
Did it click off? Oh, is that better?
I think it's on.
So Hale Boggs and Russell Long found the loopholes that Rozelle needed to get his antitrust legislation passed. And so after a quid pro quo. Is it going on again?
It must have a short in it. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I did kind of touch it. Maybe I do something later.
Oh. You're good.
I'll do my best. But again, as we had mentioned before, there was a quid pro quo handshake between Hale Boggs and Commissioner Pete Rozelle. And after that, should I just try to speak really loudly?
Just tap it and see.
I'm first with technological stuff. I'm so sorry. I can try to project. Is it on? Okay, so after the quid pro quo handshake on the steps of the Rotunda, New Orleans had a promise of a team, Rozelle had his merger, and all of this makes it look like New Orleans' racial situation is not factored into the NFL's decision whatsoever. But what's left out of that story is that between the time of the handshake and
Just talk loud.
Okay,
I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine. So between the time of the handshake on the Rotunda steps and the moment that you just saw where Rozelle announces that New Orleans has a team, in between that time, these men, Pete Rozelle, Lamar Hunt, Ralph Wilson Jr., and several other football executives did a blitz inspection of New Orleans, and the city passed. Now, louder? Oh, I kind of need my notes. So at this point, you might ask, as I did, if there was never a call for change, does that mean that the All-Stars allegations were exaggerated? Was there really not that much cleaning up that needed to be done in New Orleans? Or did the NFL do a poor inspection? Was all of this just for show? Well, what I found was the answer to both, surprisingly, is no. Even though the local contacts only had about 24 hours notice of this visit, they were prepared. Because city administrators and sports promoters had been working behind the scenes since the time of the walkout to make sure that their pro football efforts were an integrated venture. What you can't see here in this lovely picture of these white executives is the integrated entourage that assembled to meet Rozelle and his cohort when they arrived in the city. You had two Black university administrators who you see here, Albert Dent of Dillard and Norman Francis of Xavier. Also present were two Black newspapermen, C.C. Dejois and Jim Hall of the Louisiana Weekly. You also had several Black business leaders and NAACP reps on hand as well. I suppose you could argue that this could be a well choreographed display, but Rozelle did an even deeper dive. When Rozelle left town, he left behind an assistant, Buddy Young, a former player, who was tasked with doing his own investigation. And he was hosted by promoters, but he also just did some snooping around, asking questions, visiting an old friend from the Dallas Texans and so forth. And he ultimately gave Rozelle the thumbs up on New Orleans' racial progress. I should also mention that the league hired a research firm to do market research on several applicant cities. And in New Orleans' case, this included a racial assessment. And this too was a favorable report, indicating that a lot of work had been done to clean up New Orleans' racial issues since the time of the walkout. So at this point in my research, I'm convinced, I have a lot of evidence, but I'm also still wondering how it happened. You know, the behind the scenes efforts of sports promoters and city leaders is one thing, but I don't picture these men moonlighting as restaurant hosts or cab drivers or nightclub bouncers. So I'm wondering, how did the on-the-ground changes occur? And so I told you that locals were defensive after the walkout, and they were for about 6 months. And then in the summer of 1965, the NFL made two very important announcements. First, they moved into Atlanta, granting the league's 15th team to the Georgia Capitol. They established the Falcons for the 1966 season. And this is usually where people boo, so. They also announced that they were going to return to an even number of teams by expanding again within 1 year. It's also important to know that that summer, the city had one exhibition game scheduled for the NFL. Now, it was booked, of course, before the walkout, but even after the walkout, the NFL did their own investigation, factored in the success they'd always had at these quick all-business stop-offs that they do in the preseason. So they just kept the game scheduled. So in the summer of 1965, the NFL says they're going to expand again in a year. There's this NFL game looming, and in the city of New Orleans, a massive cleanup effort did begin. Only it happened in code. It was disguised as an effort to show the NFL that New Orleans had been progressive and tolerant all along. You see here, you know, show America what a great football town New Orleans really is. You know, that is, disprove the All-Stars allegations. And you'd often see my favorite slogan, now is the time to show the real pros. They are welcome in this city. You'd also see a shortened version that just said the real pros are coming. Locals knew what this meant. This was not a ticket drive. New Orleanians had proven a long time ago that they could fill a football stadium. This was a call for hospitality. And there was never really a public acknowledgement of the need for change, but there was this very thinly veiled call for it. And it worked, as we just saw. So at this point in my research, two questions have been answered. Did the walkout have an effect? And also, how did it get lost? You know, we see locals really clinging to the story of the backroom politics that has a New Orleanian vibe to it. But there was never really an acknowledgement of a need for change or that it occurred. So at this point, I'd like to read a few quotes that I ran across when I was researching that really stuck with me and fed my feeling that I needed to tell the story. The first is from former Saints head coach Sean Payton. In his 2010 book, he said, league officials thought New Orleans wasn't big enough or modern enough or rich enough, but in 1966, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle needed something important from Congress. Now, I put that up just to reinforce that this is the widely accepted version of the Saints' origin story. And nowhere in here is there any acknowledgement of a racial component at all. Now, the next quote is from William Wallace. He was a New York Times sports columnist who covered the walkout and then kept his finger on the pulse of the city from the time of the walkout until they got their team. And at that point, he wrote, the admission of New Orleans may be remembered as the way the NFL eased a political indebtedness, but that would be unfair. This city has been made ready for pro football. First of all, that's very prophetic, because that is indeed how the story is remembered. And that's also what my research showed as well, that the city was ready for pro football. And if you think about it, the All-Stars put a lot on the line. This was a very early example of civil rights activism in American sports. And they took a big risk. And they took a lot of heat at the time as well. But they also had a big impact that was never fully brought to light. I have one other quote I'd like to share, and it's from Houston Antwine in an interview around the year 2000. So he's looking back and says, right now, if you ask somebody, do you remember the AFL All-Star game that was supposed to be played in New Orleans? Nobody remembers what happened. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Well, the vast majority of the All-Stars are no longer with us. And I find it heartbreaking to think that they likely thought,
The horses are coming, watch out.
this is exciting.
He must have clicked, well, I don't know, maybe he clicked the other one on and was testing it. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think it's heartbreaking that the All-Stars likely all thought, or the ones that are still with us think, that no one remembered what they did. But I find it even more tragic that they themselves likely didn't even know the full extent of what they set in motion. Because it's not that it got lost over time, but it was swept under the rug in real time and just never fully acknowledged. So when I get to this point in my research, I really feel like I need to tell the story. But it still doesn't fully make sense to me. I can't help but wonder why the All-Star walkout was so effective. Why was that what New Orleans needed to spark rapid progress and change after the city arguably drug its feet through a decade of the civil rights movement at that point? So to do the story justice, I felt like I needed to go back in time and figure out what trends were being reversed, what forces were being combated after the walkout. And I also felt like I needed to figure out how anything could happen that quickly in the beloved but very slow-moving city of New Orleans. So I knew of course what the All-Stars had been through, the indignities that they had suffered, and I knew a little about the civil rights movement in New Orleans in general. Of course, the school migration crisis of 1960 and 1961, the daily protests for 3/4 of the school year out front of the integrated elementary schools. I'm sure we're all familiar with what Ruby Bridges endured that year. And of course, the bloody race riots in the streets of New Orleans during the first week of school integration. So knowing this much, what I expected to find was that New Orleans was this incredibly racially tense, combative place. I expected to be reading about heated battles and diehard efforts of segregationists to prevent any and all progress from taking place. But when I went back to when the national civil rights movement really started to make demands on the city of New Orleans, and I'm looking at this through a sports lens, so my timeline's a little different than other historians, but when I went back to that point, what I found was that my assumption was quite wrong. So I went back to the early 1950s when the Sugar Bowl really started to feel the pinch of the civil rights movement. More and more American schools are fielding Black athletes and refusing to leave them behind on trips to the South, which of course has been commonplace. The local segregation customs are forcing the Sugar Bowl group to just pair all white Southern schools. And the Sugar Bowl is losing its national significance and its national flavor. And for that reason, in 1955, when they landed the Naval Academy, it was a huge victory. A lot of excitement was built up in the city for this game that was going to sort of save the Sugar Bowl. And then, a week before kickoff, Academy officials announced that they had distributed their allotment of tickets without regard to the racial designations that were printed on the tickets. And at this point, everybody just sort of holds their breath and waits to see what New Orleans is going to do. And in New Orleans, what happened was nothing. There was no pushback, there were no problems. The east side of Tulane Stadium was integrated for the first time by Academy ticket holders, and there were no problems. The Sugar Bowl Committee, of course, is thrilled about this, and the next year they go so far as to invite the Integrated University of Pittsburgh squad with its one Black player, second string fullback Bobby Greer, who you see here and on the cover of my book. They also printed the Panthers tickets without the racial designations that the Navy had ignored the year before. They invited the University of Pittsburgh's integrated marching band to perform at the game, and they integrated for the first time the Tulane Stadium press box. So this is a lot of integration, a lot of change taking place all at once. And there were riots in Atlanta over Georgia Tech's pending participation. But in New Orleans, locals were just happy to have the national flavor back, to have a good matchup, and there were no problems. The game went off without a hitch. So that's January of 1956. In February, The Nation magazine ran an article that said in part, New Orleans, always a scarlet sister among the southern cities, may yet become nursemaid to a stripling regional virtue. Now, there's a lot packed into that sentence. At this time, both locally and nationally, New Orleans was thought of as being a little ahead of the rest of the South in racial matters. You know, it was known to be full of blended neighborhoods, creole identities, and a general carefree attitude, you know, the city that care forgot. So the least likely of the Southern sisters to make much of a fuss over anything, including integration. A big part of this, though, of course, as suggested here, is the city's reputation for the indulgence of vices, you know, sort of a libertarian approach to what other folks are doing, and sort of looking the other way in the presence of deviant behavior. But here it's being cast in a redeeming light. But there's a flip side to this. A few years earlier than that magazine article, Time magazine called New Orleans the city of charming Newlands. And if you think about it, New Orleans is a charming, fun tourist destination, in large part because it doesn't change much. I think it was, and arguably still is, a very New Orleanian trait to want to guard the way things are, to protect and preserve the city's unique heritage and traditions, but sometimes to the point that the city becomes a specimen in a bottle. So if you think about it, in the 1950s, no sports promoter or politician or average guy on the street is going to gain much popularity by calling for rapid or massive progress or change on any front, really. So throughout my research, I keep finding this tug of war between the two sides to that coin, the thin line between being the city that cared forgot and being the city that forgot to care. So a very clear pattern emerges going forward. You know, no one wants to be the force behind too much change too quickly, but when integration is introduced, locals largely take it in stride. We see this when promoters who are trying to get a franchise are bringing in integrated exhibition games at both City Park Stadium and Tulane Stadium. Different promoters plan all sorts of safeguards, such as block seating or group ticket drives, ways to try to minimize integration and prevent any big problems from popping up. But these safeguards continuously fall apart. Real integration occurs, and there are no problems. So what you have is piecemeal integration, just a slow chipping away at segregation, but it's always shy of some big citywide push for racial progress. The most notable non-sports related example of that is after President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that actually happened the day after it was announced that the AFL was moving their All-Star game to New Orleans. There's very little pushback to the Civil Rights Act in New Orleans. Problem again, of course, is that there's also very little push forward. You know, city administrators give a firm warning against violence, and that's largely heeded. They announced that many New Orleanian businesses are going to comply, and many do without any problems, but the city stopped short of enforcing compliance. They just said they would leave that to the federal courts. So you have a lot of the city patting itself on the back for the lack of violence and demonstrations and pushback, when really, in reality, not that much change had taken place, especially in your older, more traditional touristy areas, which is where the All-Stars would soon find themselves. And again, we see this, reluctance to push for too much change too quickly, but when it does take place, it's largely taken in stride. And this example with the Civil Rights Act really set the city up for the All-Star walkout. As one player said, quite brilliantly, as he was exiting the city had a false sense of full integration. For a city that hadn't felt like it was aggressively pushing back and resisting the civil rights movement, the walkout was a wake-up call as to how much change still needed to take place. And I believe that explains why it worked. I believe that the walkout was so effective and that change happened so quickly because there hadn't been this intense resistance that I expected to find. There had just been more of a fear of speaking out too big for too much change in the city of charming Newlands, where change could largely be thought of as taboo. So what the walkout gave locals was a shared cause, a popular cause for everyone to rally behind and openly promote change. Even if it was done, as we saw in code, white locals could still claim that New Orleans had always been progressive and tolerant, but now they had to prove it and enforce it. So that's my assessment of the walkout, why it worked, and how it came to be forgotten, and also why it deserves to be remembered. But I'd like to use the remainder of my time to mention a few other surprises that popped up in my research, and to talk a little more about the legacy of the walkout. My favorite surprise that came out of my research is the real story of how the Falcons-Saints rivalry began. I once heard a sports radio host say that this is such a great rivalry because it goes all the way back to the NFC West. And of course, he was referring to the 1970 realignment that first put the Saints and Falcons in the same conference and division. But if I hadn't been driving, I think I would have called in to argue that he was off by about a decade. I told you there were riots in Atlanta over the 1956 Sugar Bowl. And that made New Orleans look super progressive in contrast, because locals were just taking all the integration in stride. But from that point, you have Atlanta shooting off to become the city too busy to hate, as it's known. And then you see New Orleans' racial progress just inch along, with a lot of piecemeal efforts and false starts. So this contrast becomes very significant. And what you have is a very real pro football rivalry develop before either city has a team. They are repeatedly pitted in competition for a pro club. And they're mirror opposites, as I said. Atlanta has great racial progress, but they can't fill a stadium, not even close. And New Orleans has a ravenous fan base, but again, the racial problems that are standing in their way. One of my favorite anecdotes is when both cities are hosting exhibition games at the same time, as auditions for a team. And in New Orleans, in Tulane Stadium, the PA guy announces the attendance figures for both games. And of course, New Orleans has a much bigger crowd, and the fans just go berserk. They are far more excited about their competition with Atlanta than they are the sports competition that they paid to sit and watch. And so, as a result, despite the fact that during the Saints' first season, they are in different conferences and divisions, this rivalry takes center stage in 1967. At one point, late in the season, I think it's the Saints' last home game, these two teams are playing each other in the Tulane Stadium. And each team only has one win. They're calling the game the Cellar Bowl because whoever loses is probably going to be at the bottom of the entire league at the end of the season. And you have a sellout crowd, an absolute standing room only crowd. Thousands of people paid to stand up for 3 hours and watch these two one-win teams play each other. So learning about the Saints' first season in general was a lot of fun. Here, of course, you have John Gilliam in the first regular season play in Saints history, returning the opening kickoff for a touchdown against the Rams. Then Councilman Mayor Moon Landry was present at that game. And after this play, he just sat there in awe of the tens of thousands of black and white New Orleanians, all intermingled, all cheering wildly for a black football player whose home turf was Tulane Stadium. And he just thought, it wasn't long ago at all that this would have been unthinkable. And I should say, New Orleans didn't just clean house until they got their team. The team remained a very unifying, united force in the city, and integration was key as the club was being built. In fact, New Orleans becomes the first pro football team with black ownership, as C.C. DeJoie and Norman Francis are brought on as minority investors. Likewise, because of the very equal opportunity way that the club was built, the first majority owner, John Meekum Jr., was given an award originally designed to honor Branch Rickey for his efforts in integrating Major League Baseball. And it was also just fun to see how the fan base developed around this terrible first-year team. The fans actually stunned the league with their devotion to the terrible team and their crowd noise. You have play being suspended at several points during the first season for this unprecedented noise. You've even had outside sports reporters saying Roselle needs to reprimand the Saints because their crowd is just too loud and rowdy. Of course, that's not surprising, but it's kind of fun to see it goes all the way back to the first year. So on that note, I'll end with my take on the legacy of the walkout. I would argue that the boycott forced the city to unite, to prove their unity in order to get the team. And I think that shaped what the Saints became and still are to the city of New Orleans in a way that expansion didn't necessarily affect other cities, whose major criteria might have been building an adequate stadium or meeting a season ticket quota. And it was the Saints team was a citywide win from the beginning, and it was immediately folded into the New Orleanian identity. Then Councilman Moon Landry said during the Saints' first season that the Saints were responsible for a new birth in the spirit of New Orleans. And I think that could be said at multiple points in the team's history. I certainly think it was true in 1967. And as someone who was in the Superdome for the post-Katrina Superdome reopener, I think it, quite verbally against the Atlanta Falcons, I think it would be hard to argue against repeating that sentiment that night. And I've been making that argument for a while before I realized, or at least remembered, that the statue commemorating Steve Gleason's blocked punt that night expresses a similar sentiment. And I would say that is quite a legacy. I recently befriended another historian who had the privilege of interviewing several of the AFL All-Stars, and he's a collector, so we had them sign their football cards. And many of them included the sentence, "I was a proud member of the AFL All-Star Game boycott, January 1965. And it just made me so happy to see that, because while I don't believe they ever got nearly the recognition that they deserve, I do hope they are or were proud of what they did. And my book is my attempt to honor them for that. So I'll leave it there, and I thank you for letting me share with you.
What questions do y'all have today for Dr. Erin?
I just wanted to point out that the All-Star teams only had 28 players on each team. Today they got about 50.
Yeah, that is true.
I also wanted to tell you that the picture you have, Johnny Unitas coming to the stadium to play, that night, he played about 2 minutes, and Gary Quazzo backed him up. He eventually became the Saints quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody, in those days, when we go to a game, everybody wore a suit, and it rained for most of the game, and a little bit in the second game. It was a doubleheader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David Dixon said that he won I'm pretty sure this was tongue in cheek, but he said in an interview that he won the Hairdressers of New Orleans Gratitude Award because all the women who'd been at that game had to go get their hair redone.
I was absolutely gonna say it was another rebirth, because I was there that night too, and it was way more than a game.
Oh,
Wow.
It was absolutely more than a game.
It really was, and I don't know that other cities' teams could have been that for them. I think it's something special what the Saints are for New Orleans.
Absolutely. We're probably a small money market, but I don't know of any more loyal base out there. I had season tickets at Tulane Stadium. That's how long I've been doing this.
I would love to go back in that stadium.
I wanted to say that I saw it at Gilliam. I was there for the Gilliam run back. I sold programs at Tulane Stadium for about 10 years, and everybody thought it was fixed. They thought they had set it up like that, so everybody would get excited. And people didn't sit down for a long time.
That's
They were really
funny.
excited.
I saw an interview with Gilliam where he said he was standing back there praying the ball didn't come to him. And it did, he was a hero, but it didn't take long for that game for people to realize it wasn't fixed because it didn't go so well after that.
Was there something really surprising about your research that you hadn't figured on, but you're like, this really surprises me?
I think the biggest surprise for me was just how many prominent white New Orleanians were very pro-integration and just quiet. I just kept running into it seemed like everybody wanted somebody else to take the
Oh,
step. You know, David Dixon, the Tulane Board of Administrators, just from my research focusing on football, and sports writers were scared to say too much in their columns. They would just print like letters from people writing in, or maybe take quotes from other like northern newspapers and share them, but never wanted to put it in their own words. I mean, I shouldn't say never, but they were very hesitant. And that was my biggest surprise, was just how much, how many prominent New Orleanians, like I said, were all for it and just sort of sitting back hoping someone else would be the one to push things forward. And I really think that's why, once there was a popular cause to rally behind, it could go so fast, because a lot of people were just finally relieved that things could move forward. I mean, I'm thinking politicians on state and local level, business leaders, like I said, Tulane, David Dixon, just this long list of people who really wanted to try to push things forward and just were afraid, didn't want to go too far too fast.
It's sort of like dipping your toe in you're afraid to put your toe in there, but it's fun.
Exactly.
When you finally get in, it was a big deal, right?
Yeah, that was my biggest surprise, was I just expected to see like, oh, they had to really combat these huge forces, and it was sort of the opposite. It was just that they just sort of had to turn the
Fearful.
public rhetoric around enough to where it was okay. And a lot of it was New Orleans' difference from the rest of the state. You know, northern Louisiana politicians are causing a lot of trouble. The school riots were scheduled, literally scheduled, by northern Louisiana politicians to happen in the streets of New Orleans. So international news has New Orleans painted as this terribly racist place because there's these bloody race riots. Well, what happened was the northern Louisiana politicians scheduled this, held a rally, and basically a lot of young kids who were excited to be given the assignment of civil disobedience run out into the streets and cause all these problems that made international news, when really it wasn't an organic thing that sprung up in New Orleans, but that's the way it appears to the rest of the world.
Right. Did you do any interviews for the book, Erin, with notable saints figures or historians, or did you have interviews along the way with, you know, people who remember some firsthand type experiences? And was that part of your research at all? Was making contact with folks who might have some grassroots knowledge of having lived through some of this?
Well, I did essentially 4 interviews on my own. I was lucky that a friend had an uncle who was the starting quarterback for Georgia Tech in that first integrated game. So he and 3 of his buddies sat down for an interview with me. But my biggest claim to fame in the interview column is I got to interview Norman Francis. And it was just the most spectacular morning. I mean, he's just so, you know, his I mean, he tours me around his house with all his pictures of all, you know, he's made us such an extraordinary life. But,
Right.
You know, what prompted it was, I just wanted to know about him being one of the first Black owners in pro football history, but it was so much more than that coming from him, of course. So, yeah, that was incredible. But I was also lucky that the Historic New Orleans Collection has an amazing oral history program. So they had already tapped a lot of, you know, David Dixon and a lot of the Sugar Bowl founders, and just an amazing collection of oral history. So I got to, you know, do that without actually conducting the interviews myself.
You could hear them talking about their memoirs and what they lived and the impact it had. That's something that the Hancock County Library System is just starting as our oral histories project, where we are capturing the life and legacies and stories and anecdotes and memories and issues that affected people's lives in Hancock County. We are actively capturing those stories, Katrina, Camille, Betsy, and getting those committed to our little our hub. And eventually you'll be able to go to our website and access those memories, those verbal accounts, because people, you know, if it's your memory and then you pass away, it's gone. And so we're actively trying to capture. So that's what she's referring to, is the Oral Histories Project in New Orleans. I bet that was a gold mine.
It was. I was actually told that I made it look like a, listening to the interviews was its own little spectator moment for me, because people would just like catch my reaction as I'm listening to amazing histories with my little headphones on and taking my notes, and I would just, apparently I got very visibly excited while I was listening to this interview.
That to me is just the essence of academic research. When you're just in your element and you love it and you're living it, that is just delicious to me.
And these people had such incredible stories. I mean, like I said, it was really exciting to hear these progressive New Orleanians, you know, talking about where they stood on these issues at the moment,
Right.
how they reacted to it, what they felt like they could and couldn't do, and yeah, it was pretty extraordinary.
How long did it take you to, I'm sorry, Jim.
I just wanted to say, who was the mayor while all this was going on? Was it Morrison?
Morrison was, in the beginning of my book, Morrison is there, but it was Skiro was there as well.
Skiro took over. Morrison was elected because of his support in the minority community every time.
Yeah.
And I think he dropped the ball going forward, but there was really no problems that I knew of. I mean, I even worked at a place called the Coliseum Arena. I was the fireman, I had to sit upstairs, and in those days, everything was segregated. So the entire audience where I was sitting was minority.
Mhm.
So all those people, you know, I'd sit on a chair, and they had a fire, I had to open the door. But all these people would come in, and they had fried chicken, they had chitlins, okay? They had greens, they had Virginia Dare wine, and when they passed, they all offered me something. You know, so I never saw any race relationships, and where I lived, in the next block, minority family had a regular house. And the guy walked past us every day when he got off the public transit. You know, so, you know, go to Chicago, senior in high school with a bunch of kids, and you can't find a minority house in certain sections, it's all in one section. I thought that was such a contradiction. So we were way ahead of those people, I hate to say that.
New Orleans had earned its reputation for being ahead of, as you say, not just the rest of the South, but I think New Orleans did have a very extraordinary racial situation.
I'll just add to you, you mentioned about the politicians from North Louisiana vis-a-vis the race relations. North Louisiana roots for the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, that's how different they are from us in New Orleans.
Yeah, I know when McKinnon was trying to get the Superdome, that was his battle, was convincing the rest, and particularly North Louisiana, to get on board.
Exactly.
Because they just thought it's just gonna be a New Orleans thing, and they already had other loyalties, so.
Who was the governor when they built it, you remember?
I just know McKinnon put in all the muscle. I'm not sure about when it finally got
Well,
open.
you know how McKiffen got elected, I don't know if y'all old enough to remember this. McKiffen was the Public Service Commission. They had just built the G&O Bridge to go to Algiers, Louisiana, and they had a toll on the bridge. Well, McKiffen gets into the race running against Morrison and people like that, of that caliber, and he said, I'm gonna take the toll off. Forget it. No runoff. I think you won the first.
I did not know that.
Are you selling your book, Dave?
Yes. My associate is actually.
I'm outside the book.
Is it $30? $30. How long did it take you start to finish to pull the book together? Was this your dissertation?
No, that
It
was the
wasn't?
problem. No, actually, the problem is I already had started my dissertation when I stumbled upon that story.
Uh-oh.
So now I had to finish my dissertation and then get back to this.
Oh,
But thankfully, the fellowship with the Historic Knowledge Collection followed up graduation pretty well, so, yeah. It's hard to say how long it took because, we've had a lot of life
There were some
happen
complications.
between the time I started and the
Oh, I
time I
understand.
finished. So I don't even know how I would estimate, but,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What did you focus on for your dissertation? I'm just curious.
I was not cut out to be writing about sports in any stretch. I was actually studying gender and family structure. So my dissertation was actually on the changing structure of family, the changing role of fatherhood in modern American life. So it was nowhere near sports. I accidentally wrote this book. I just stumbled upon this story and no one else was telling it, and I just felt like I needed to. So yeah, I sometimes call myself an accidental author because I don't think I ever said I want to write a book. I don't know, it just sort of, these guys got me hooked and I couldn't let it go, so.
Are there bookstores in New Orleans carrying your title?
Yes.
I would think so. Anything else before, yeah,
Another immigration story that Dr. Francis was involved with, he and Father Victor at Loyola decided that the three Catholic colleges uptown needed to integrate, have a relationship. And they flew on a plane to Washington and got a grant, a federal grant, came back home and created a three-school program, first one in Louisiana, undergraduate program in social work, where those students from Dominican, Xavier, and Loyola became members of a newly created department, and those students had to rotate among the three institutions. And this was started in 1968 and lasted through the year that when Dominican was collapsed and was taken over by Loyola. So at the same time the sports issue was being dealt with, Dr. Francis and others were very instrumental in putting together and solving some of the issues on the education front.
Absolutely, I did not know that story, but Dr. Francis is just exceptional.
That was when they dissolved the Loyola Dentistry School.
Oh.
And from what I heard, yeah, that's when they got rid of it.
Well, I was the director of that consortium program. It's called the New Orleans Consortium. And ultimately, we got a bus that hauls students around to solve issues. We did have a few parents call up and, despite their students' interest, maybe actually joining the program, and the parents would pull out tell their children that they could not be a part of this because they had to go over to that public school. And so it was a very difficult time.
Forms to school like Xavier is really outstanding today, up to today.
This is not the same topic, but I know a lot of people here probably like history. There is another program tonight in Gulfport at the Mississippi Aviation Heritage Museum. Colonel Alva Matheson will be talking about Amelia Earhart. It's at 6 o'clock, goes in at 5:30, it's $10 for the tour of the museum. But anyway, I will invite you all to that, if you're interested. They have a monthly history program over there. And it's a wonderful museum.
Do y'all remember Rosemary Russa from Authors and Characters, the astronaut's daughter?
Yes.
So her husband runs the Aviation Museum on Pass Road.
And Colonel Matheson, he's in his 90s now, but he's fought in 4 different wars and had like 16,000 hours in the air. But he was involved with the original Yom Kippur War, Vietnam, and a couple others. So he's very interesting to talk to.
Well, we want to thank Dr. Erin and Dr. Scott both for coming. Would you help me give them a warm round of applause, please? Erin, we have a little something for you. If I were a good hostess, I would have found a ribbon to tie around it. Anyway, this is a little thing. Good. And I have a box for you. We can get you a box so it won't tumble on the way back to New Orleans. Thank you so much. Erin has a book for sale. Scott will take your money, I'm sure. So please feel free at this time to come on up and buy a copy, to have it signed. Makes great gifts. I'm always reminding you of that. Otherwise, this concludes our Authors and Characters session. It's so good to see everybody. Wait, don't go anywhere. I get to say how special you are. Just relax. Just hang on. I just want to tell y'all, thank you so much for your support this year. And I will be excited to see y'all in the new year. And I hope all of you have beautiful, restful, peaceful, joyous holidays. Merry Christmas and mwah. Thank you. And come see us. I'm gonna put the invitation to the gala, it's just so fun to say. Pick up an invitation, swing by and raise a glass Saturday night, okay? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna put it right at the beginning.
Would you come help me?